I woke up just now, when my senses are still alert, to tell you what I experienced a moment ago. So, when I woke up from my dream, I didn't wake up completely. My body was half conscious. I saw a figure entering my room from the entrance door. At first, it was walking slowly towards me, near the bed, but I wasn't capable to distinguish the full room, especially the part next to my right. I was totally paralyzed, even more and more when the creature approached. I could clearly see the black shadow smoke of the full body, head, and the body silhouette. We were face to face. He was tall and watched me, and during the time I tried to look at him, there was a cut of my vision each 2 seconds, like blinking. I was really pissed off. I felt angry and struggled to move my body and my arm to show him the F symbol. He was quite surprised that I could move, and he moved his left arm like he was about to fly or, I don't know, maybe show or express something. I woke up and the silhouette merged with the curtains in front of me. Like, what the fuck? After that, a lot of memories came out of nowhere in my mind. I realized that in our lives, we are really alone with just our own presence, even when we're talking with someone. After finishing the conversation, we continue our own life alone, like it was a curse to not be able to truly be with someone. Like everyone was feeling the same. Maybe that's what the creature felt and transmitted me to this, or is it a lesson? Somehow, I have compassion for these things. I don't know why. Maybe because of their incapacity to fully be positive and see human life and its value. So, I was living down in West Texas in this national park where the restaurant I was working at the time rested at the top of a 15-minute hike up a mountain trail from the housing they had us in. I closed up the restaurants after everyone left each night, so I was always an hour or two later coming down the hill than everyone else. Usually pretty empty, really quiet. Uncommon to encounter anyone else, as the only thing at the top of the mountain is the closed restaurants, gift shop and store, and some of the trailheads. There isn't much reason for anyone else to be on the trail at that hour. And this one fucking night, I'm coming down. No moon, so it was pitch black, empty trail, characteristically quiet. I round this last bend to get to my house, and right before I get off the trail to take a shortcut through the thicket of cactus and brush, there were maybe 15 to 20 trees, even though it's a desert. The top of the mountain has a high Sierra microclimate. When I heard my best friend slash roommate call out my name, clear as day in the other direction. He said my name, and when I turned, said it again. In retrospect, it sounded funny. It was close, 15 yards maybe, but it sounded far off at the same time. Like if someone recorded his voice from far away, but played it very nearby. It just sounded off, but not enough to flip a switch immediately. And maybe I'm painting the memory of it differently than it actually sounded. So I'm facing my house, maybe 50 yards away, and the voice comes from directly to my left. On this foothill of the mountain we'd hike around on sometimes. It was much more tree coverage than the trail I was on, and considerably more than the thickest separating me from the clearing surrounding my house. If you walked 5 feet in the direction the voice came from, you'd completely disappear from the view of anyone on the trail, or on the back porch of the house, immediately. So hearing my friend's voice calling me over, I was like, oh, cool, we're night hiking. And I turned to follow it. But right before I take my first step into the tree line, I hear his actual voice down on our porch saying, hey, who are you talking to? Which stops me. I turn back to face my house, confused as shit, just in time to see this fucking thing burst out of the fucking thicket I was just about to shortcut through, to begin with, before hearing the first voice and turning away. And from the exact spot I'd walked down every single night, this fucking thing bolts. It was a humanoid, technically, but the thing was tall as shit and way too skinny for a human. Like at least 8 feet tall, but slim. It looked inhumanly slender. He was hunched over and running like he'd just burst off a track mark, you know? But kept that same form the whole time. Never got all the way upright. Okay, so as for the colour, that has always fucked with me. Because for one, I'm colourblind as shit. And it was like a greenish yellow thing, and I had greens and yellows mixed up a lot. This hue of green and yellow at least. And for two, it looked like it was giving off its own glow. Which has always sounded so absolutely ludicrous, I never tell anyone that. I don't absolutely trust to give me the benefit of the doubt before thinking that I'm completely bullshitting. Because if I heard this story, I would honestly think someone at the very least might be a little bit bullshitting. Our back porch light was on though, and the thing lined up with where it would have been shining. So if this thing was translucent, it definitely could have taken on that sheen by reflecting the porch light. The colours do kind of line up, I guess. If you'd reflected the light, it may have looked like this thing's colour, but it certainly wasn't identical. Honestly though, I swear it had its own shine to it, like looking at a glow stick that's dying. More than enough to see, but kind of faint regardless. It was a light that definitely wasn't there a second before when I'd gotten to the shortcut. It would have struck out for the last 50 yards of the walk at least. It should be noted, had I followed that thing's voice, two things would have happened. One, I would have completely disappeared from the view of anyone. And two, I would have turned my back on whatever that thing was and entered into a thicket of trees, weeds, and cactus, far too dense for me to turn around, run, and fight back anything. And that trail, I would have gone toward leads directly to the edge of a cliff that drops down into a massive break in the mountain. The window in the Big Bend National Park. That cleanly drops all of the 6,000 foot to the wide open desert below. What could be the purpose of that direction? To be honest, if I was going to try to do some nefarious shit, it would be the perfect place to both find someone and lead them quickly to a spot where no one else would come up on you. Legit, in the middle of the day, you could probably make someone disappear over there if you wanted. Anyway, how this thing was running, it immediately felt like I'd spooked it. Like how a deer runs off at a noise. But this was different in that it seemed a lot more determined. It seemed intelligent, aware of its own movement, not just acting out of instinct. Kind of like spooking a person if they'd been watching you from the bushes or something, you know? Like spooked but sentient and definitely acting like I just foiled some nefarious plan. So naturally, I also fucking bolt, exposing my back to this thing, but taking the opposite, slightly longer way to my back porch. My fucking buddy, God bless his soul, is still there when I make it, and he asks again, "Who are you with?" His face is just as confused as shit, and he keeps looking past me, and I'm like, "You heard it too, right?" And he says, "Yeah, where are they?" And I was like, What? There was multiple. Apparently, from his perspective, he had heard multiple voices alongside my own, all carrying on and joking around, talking back and forth pretty loudly. He said there were at least 3 other voices talking to mine, but that it sounded like a whole crowd coming down the trail. He said he could clearly hear us getting closer and closer for the past few minutes, and just assumed I'd run into a hiking group and talked with them as we headed down. Not the most uncommon thing in the daytime, but pretty uncommon for the hour of night. It took me a minute to show him that I wasn't messing with him and had not just split off from a group of hikers. I was completely alone and had not vocalized a word until he called up to ask, "Who are you with?" It took a second to even express my side of what was going on. I was so out of whack, I couldn't find the words to actually explain, so I just kept shouting, "I swear to God, I just heard your voice. And then this fucking thing, dude, this thing," or something similar. Eventually, it registered that there were no other lights on the trail. I wasn't using a flashlight that night, so maybe there was actually some moon out. And I had just heard his voice calling me off trail and into the dark, and we both began trying to figure out what the fuck we'd witnessed. Okay, this part might be a little crazy, but I'm not implying anything, I'm just saying. This is what I'd been doing on the walk down before this happened. So, obviously, walking home solo, I hadn't actually said a word. Whoever he heard was certainly not me, and I certainly didn't come with a crowd. But I had been praying like crazy on the hike down. There had just been this super dark negative energy in the house lately, and I was just trying to kind of surround myself with light and positivity, asking God to give me strength before I walked back in. And out of nowhere, midway through the trail, I got this like absolutely overwhelming joy, like an absolute ecstasy. I was like screaming inside, happy as bones, and just felt like I could take on the whole motherfucking world. Like no matter what came, I could take it. Maybe I'm implying something, because call me crazy, but I've always felt like that I had something to do with how the night turned out, as opposed to how it maybe would have. I don't know. I know that part really doesn't make me sound insane, but so does the rest of it, so whatever. I certainly don't think it was a coincidence. I'm just not sure what to make of any of it. Every detail means every detail. That's just what was going on with your boy as the walk was happening. It would have been a noteworthy and memorable night had the thing not done any of this. It was that powerful of an energy. Anyway, that's pretty much it. The only other thing is our memories of it. Out of nowhere, I just sort of stopped thinking of it. Not like forgot, but like it was hidden behind some of the thick fog in my head. The next morning, I told the story to a friend and she uncharacteristically shut me down and just said something like, "Y'all are just crazy and getting scared of these mountains," and just walked away. It really wasn't like her to just dismiss someone, especially a friend, without even hearing them out. She was a real empathetic lady. It was legit like she just heard something that triggered a memory she refused to touch and shut it down before it got too close. I don't know. I could be reading into it, but that's happened a couple of times with this story. And anyway, we've been living on that mountain on and off for a few years at that point and had never once heard or seen anything remotely similar to that thing. Until that night, we'd never even heard a story vaguely resembling it. It just wasn't like we got spooked of our own house or the trail we took twice a day, every day. And it wasn't like we were seeing and hearing things based on stories we'd projected into the darkness, you know? But the weirdest fucking thing happened the moment she walked away. It was legit like a fucking fog just slowly poured over the memory. And the last time I remember thinking of it was that moment. And then it just fucking disappeared for months. How in the world does something that massive, that frightening happen in your life, and you just stop thinking about it? And then one day it just popped the fuck back up. I was honestly so surprised and unsure of how I hadn't thought of it in so long. It was almost more baffling than anything we'd actually witnessed. I asked my friend just before I sent this if he'd felt the same fog thing, and he said absolutely. He doesn't really like talking about that night, honestly, and he's told me that, but I cannot help but bring it up as often as possible, hoping by talking it through, we'd find some sort of explanation for any of what happened. Even as I typed the message, though, I felt like I'd asked him a million times already and just forgotten his answer. Maybe I have. That isn't a super uncommon thing to do, I guess. This happened somewhere between the early to mid 2000s. I was a kid, but old enough to remember a few things from that day. Backstory. Every single Sunday for most of our childhood, my dad would take my sister and I to a local forest to let off some steam, and so that my mum could have a few hours to herself. We'd go around 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and had our regular route that my dad, and even us kids, knew by heart. The day this happened, we parked in the car park and headed up the steep incline that leads to the forest, as normal. You can either walk across the car park toward a short, flat trail around the pond, or head up into the proper forest, which is what we always chose to do. Once we were up the incline, my sister and I were free to run ahead, as long as my dad could still see us. something I usually took advantage of. Apart from this day. As soon as we were in the trees, I noticed immediately that something felt off. I can't put it into words any more than that. All I knew in my kid brain was that the forest felt different, and I instinctively knew that I should stay closer to my dad. I still walked ahead of him and my sister, but only by a few steps. The only way I can think to explain the feeling is wariness. Like when you have to go to bed on your own as a kid after watching a scary film. It wasn't flat out terror, but I was jumpy and on alert. There was an atmosphere in those trees I hadn't felt before, and haven't felt since. I can't remember much of the walk, just that it felt different the entire way, but I definitely remember the end of it. Remember how I said there's a short trail around a pond? We'd hit our marker, and we're about to get onto that trail that leads back around the car park, but the path wasn't there. My dad was almost spinning in circles trying to find this path he'd had no problem finding for years. And my feeling was confirmed. He turned to me and my sister and was explaining to us how weird it was that the path wasn't there. And then he turned to look again, and there it was. As soon as we saw that path and pond and people again, the funny feeling disappeared. We still talk about it to this day. Whenever my dad and I talk about weird stuff, we always mention how we have our own story. It always starts along the lines of, "Do you remember when the path disappeared?" He didn't have the funny feeling I had until the path thing happened, and I told him about it later, but he did experience something himself while we walked that day. He remembers seeing a man in a red beanie ahead of us at one point, who suddenly vanished somewhere it wasn't possible to vanish like that. So yeah, that's my unexplainable story. It's not as exciting as most on here, but it's certainly a core memory for me and something that definitely kick-started my interest in the unexplained. I could give you a million times as a kid and young adult. I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older, because of forts and carvings we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed and play Monopoly. For sake of backstory on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants he came across. He had no fear of going and camping out by himself. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone, because I could never shake the feeling of being watched, which was just paranoia, but still an uneasy feeling. Anyways, camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs wood. Sun's down, and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on this little chair he always brought and loading up this makeshift bong, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off some of the logs we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again. Definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbush. I knew by the sound it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy." And when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him. I had been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire, we were in pure darkness. Then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off the spot or moved much for over an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was had sat crouched watching us without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill, spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped along looking at that point. Nobody went into the tent, and I had very short, light sleep, sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, we talk about it. It's been 7 to 8 years since it happened, and my forester friend hasn't camped by himself out there since. It was the fall of 2009, and at the time I was 16 years old. I live in the central part of North Carolina. Nowadays, the cities are loaded with things to do for the Halloween season. But back then, the best form of entertainment I could come up with was to visit the Devil's Tramping Ground with a few friends. The Devil's Tramping Ground is a local legend. It sits right side of Siler City, North Carolina, about an hour away from where I live. And I just got my license, so why not? For those of you unfamiliar with the local of this legend, the Devil's Tramping Ground is a perfect circular spot of dead soil in the middle of the woods. Despite the greenery around it, nothing grows in that circle. The legend says that if you drop or leave anything in the circle, it's moved and or disappears by morning, as the devil supposedly comes here to plot his evil doings against humanity late at night, pacing in a circle as he thinks. That's the gist, but feel free to do a little research if you're interested. It's a decent read. Siler City is a sticks and bars town with long, barren roads that seemingly translate to, "Don't stop until you get the hell out of here." It was on one such road where I began to feel uneasy. Rural areas always have that heavy Twilight Zone energy, and the road we were on, conveniently titled Devil's Tramping Ground Road, was completely lacking streetlights. The only thing illuminating the overworked asphalt was the fading yellow headlights of my 2002 Mercury Cougar and the useless glow of a crescent moon. In those dim lights, we began to see splattered graffiti on the road leading up to the location. Creepy things I didn't expect, but never really would have understood the impact of until I saw them. In white paint, the road was decorated in crude warnings. The one I remember the most was "The Devil Lives Here," and a huge white cross in front of an opening in the forest. I parked on the side of the road. The ground was immediately not as creepy as I expected. It wasn't too deep into the woods. In fact, the clearing could be made out from the road. Not as menacing as I had imagined. Maybe it was the empty beer cans or red Solo cups lying all around. Obviously, people partied there. Or maybe it was the jokes my friend and I started making almost immediately that calmed my nerves. But it was 2 something in the morning. We decided to catch Lucifer right on this hour. And I remember feeling less on edge than I was on the road. My flashlight would get eaten through the trees if I moved upwards, so I focused its beam on the soil, truly more interested in finding signs of the paranormal than my friends were. There were 4 of us in total. 2 of my friends went back to the car after a while. It was cold, and there wasn't much to see. I stayed back with a buddy of mine. I brought a Ziploc with me, along with a pocket Bible, a rosary in my pocket, just in case, and a stuffed rabbit that one of my best friends had given me. Before leaving, I scooped some dirt up and added it to the Ziploc. I found the prospect of dead soil so interesting, and figured that maybe studying under proper light compared to other soil would give me a better idea of what happened here. Alien radiation? Climate change? Sulfur? Maybe the devil was just busy that night. In between jokes and complaining about the cold, we heard someone walking in the depth of the woods. This wasn't a mistaken sound. This wasn't an, I think someone is walking in the woods. This was a definite sound, a definite feeling. This was deep behind the bush, between the trees, and these footsteps were heavy and unashamed of being heard. This was the first time I noticed no crickets were in these woods. There was no sound other than us and these steps, and I was even more unwilling to lift my little flashlight, which was tucked under my armpit and pointed towards my soil sample. My eyes didn't need adjusting, and so we stood there as I made out the shape of something in these woods. It was dark, but I could see it. It was tall, but not disgustingly tall. It was human-shaped. It stood on 2 feet. It would walk and stop, then walk and walk, then stop. Towards us, I think. We were petrified. Neither my friend nor I moved. I don't think we even breathed. I was so overcome with fear that I felt numb, but a little terrible ran through my entire body. We just stared. Later, we would discuss how we both wondered if it had seen us, and talk about how we didn't want to move in case it hadn't. At this future time, we would also discuss the smell. It was an awful, putrid scent, burning feces and rotting eggs and rotten meat. I grew up Catholic, hence the Bible and rosary, and have always been told that smell means the devil is around. That didn't help my case then. Even typing that now, I'm slightly trembling. This thing stayed toying with us among the sticks of the forest. I say sticks because at the time, very little greenery was alive. I was certain at one point that it saw me. I had that sixth sense, feeling I was being stared at right back. And suddenly, I had a feeling of overwhelming, unbearable despair. I realised then that my friend had been clutching the back collar of my shirt. I think I was so paralysed with fear that I had ceased to feel anything but that numbness. I wasn't even cold anymore, but when I felt my friend's hand, I dropped everything in my arms and stood up, then hauled ass back to the car. Not running, just very hurried. I was sure my friend was behind me, but between us, and in all honesty, I didn't even think about it at the time. I was just ready to go. I was so ready to go, in fact, that I missed the clear path completely and took off in between trees and bush, heading towards the yellow glow of the headlights. It wasn't an incredibly long trek. Like I said before, the road was right there. But it felt awful and long to me. And it was enough for those tiny branches to leave little scrapes and even some cuts down my hands, cheeks and neck. This whole ordeal can't have lasted too long. When I got back to my car, the keys were already in the ignition. The other 2 friends had the heat on, and they both asked me what happened. The friend who stayed behind with me got in the passenger seat soon after, and we took off. Our other friends, the friends who had been in the car, pointed out that our eyes were swollen and bright red. I think we'd been crying, or at least it looked like we had been. I looked in the rear view mirror and my pupils were abnormally dilated. My eyelids were puffy and tender and red. Keep in mind, this could all have been some form of explanation. Maybe the fear made us cry without us knowing. And maybe the darkness combined with our nervous reactions enlarged our pupils. But it was still very odd. I realised long after that I left my Bible, my stuffed rabbit, and my Ziploc bag of dirt in the circle. I considered going back the next day in broad daylight, but I haven't been back there since. I still wonder and worry about who has my stuff.